cohesion, strength, representativeness, autonomy, and efficiency to our associations. Knowing specificity means knowing the identity of a syndrome, in our case Down syndrome. It means studying which are the typical characteristics that define it, that do not occur or that occur differently or in different proportions in other types of cognitive disability. It means differentiating in a scientifically objective way and not without gaps and difficulties between what is common with other types of intellectual disability and what is typical of Down syndrome. Specificity is not negating the main things that are common with other syndromes or with cognitive disability in general. It is evident that there are many common elements that we have to know how to take advantage of and that we must have no problem in recognizing. Specificity does not mean segregating people with Down syndrome with respect to the rest of the population, whether or not they have a cognitive disability. Nor does it mean setting up ghettos for people with Down syndrome, with the syndrome, or creating exclusive centres or services for people with Down syndrome, especially those of adult age. When these exist, they are the exception that confirms the rule, and normally they are organised today because they were created years ago as centres of research, resources and integration support. And they are what they are known as Down syndrome referral centres. Nobody has said that a young person with Down syndrome cannot work or train or accompany a home or occupy a home with other people, whether they are disabled or not. What we do defend is the providing of services at all levels, schooling, labour, social, and they must be done in an absolutely specialised way and with the specific programmes that cater for the limitations and specific needs of each person with Down syndrome, and that gradually this care must be given in the ordinary services, schools, hospitals, etc. of our community. Down syndrome today is undoubtedly the syndrome of genetic origin that is most studied and best known in the world. Specific care for people with Down syndrome is what has led to the change over the last 30 years of the image of people of this syndrome, and to help and to us being able to look to the future with optimism. For that reason, today we learn to speak, to read. They learn to speak, to write, to read, to write, to control their behaviour, to work and to behave like children, young people and adults of their age who do not have Down syndrome. There are still people who advocate that people with disabilities must be cared for, educated and rehabilitated in large centres with common models that do not cater for the specificity of the different syndromes. When today, in contrast, in most advanced countries, a model is preferred where a small centre located in an integratory environment where the primary indicator is quality specialised care, these being key elements for caring for people with cognitive disability, simply because their effectiveness is scientifically proven. Furthermore, researchers Suzanne Cassidy and
Okay. Pero bueno, please continue, yeah.
Suzanne and Judith Allinson released in their book, published by John Wiley in New Jersey, Management of Genetic Syndromes, which is the latest version. In its latest version, identifies and describes the incidence, etiology, pathogenesis, and differential diagnosis, genetics, treatment, and bibliography of 84 different syndromes, all of genetic origin. These would include Angelman, Cornelia de Lange, Down, Fragile X, Prader-Willi, Rett, Smith-McGuinness, Turner-Williams, etc., etc. Next slide then is all these syndromes are associated with a greater or lesser degree of cognitive disability, and their diagnosis and prevalent treatment depend on the specific weight of the following symptoms. A, organic problems, which is health, cognitive disability, and behavioural problems. The consequence and treatment supports must be increasingly more specific because they have increasing knowledge of the peculiarities of each syndrome. However, the key methodology dimension for studying specificity must necessarily focus on the inter-syndromic comparison, as one cannot talk about the particularities of any syndrome without making comparisons with other syndromes. Over recent years, many steps forward have been made in medical research into Down syndrome. Most has been aimed at prenatal diagnosis and very few resources devoted to specific treatments. But perhaps you will allow me, if it is a good idea, to clarify some point. I defined Down syndrome many years ago, saying that it was not a disease but a condition, a singular way of being and living in the world, determined genetically, from which we people who call ourselves normal have a great deal to learn. It is a great, nice definition, very nice definition, and it contains the key element, determined genetically. In other words, the phenotype is conditioned by the genotype, of which is what means by this, which marks the specificity for us. In this book, and in brackets, what we know today about Down syndrome, therapeutic perspectives, that's the title of the book, which Juan published last year through the Spanish publishing house CEPE, you have an explanation and the details of the specificity of Down syndrome, including a comparison with other syndromes, Williams, Prader-Willi, Engelmann, etc. However, allow me to highlight the most important points of the most concerned families today as their children with Down syndrome advance towards the age of 50. In the brain of a Down syndrome person, there is a real reduction in the number of neurons and consequently the number of connections established between them. Not in the whole brain, but in some very specific regions such as the prefrontal cortex, the hippocampus, the cerebellum, and the temporal lobe. This means that the development and function of neuronal networks is distorted and compromised, and the function of these neuronal networks in which the neuronal activity of these structures intervenes. However, the site and degree of affectation are highly variable from one individual to the next. That is the reason for the enormous variety that we find in the behavioural phenotype of a person with Down syndrome. It is true that there is usually a relatively constant compromise in the development of language and communication, the development of attention, some forms of memory, and determined manifestations of executive function, so closely linked with the prefrontal cortex. There are, however, other brain regions and areas that remain undamaged and impose their own identity, such as areas of nuclei related to affectivity, with the procedural memory, with the development of certain interests and tastes, and with artistic sensitivity. Analysis using functional magnetic resonance techniques and other methods of exploration is starting to indicate to us precisely that predominance of areas of activity of the limbic system over those of the prefrontal cortex, and the deviations that appear in functional networks of the brain of a person with Down syndrome. It has been proven that patients with Down syndrome age earlier than the rest of the population, and that furthermore they have a high probability of developing a premature pathological aging that may result in Alzheimer's, and a greater risk of presenting certain health problems with functional and cognitive deterioration. However, the general aging of this population will depend on particular characteristics of each person, and above all, how their life in general has progressed, and their adult life in particular. Current studies document that in Down syndrome, Alzheimer's disease may appear in some 10 to 25% at ages between 40 and 49 years of age. some 20% to 50% in the decade of the 50s, and between 30 and 75% in the in ages over 60. This disease is characterized by the fast evolution that develops over 4 or 5 years and continues until death. Studies show that the start of Alzheimer's type dementia in people with Down syndrome is clearly manifested by emotional and conduct changes, in other words, by changes in personality and behaviour, as well as cognitive changes, especially in relation to memory. Many of these changes are associated with the distribution of the frontal lobe, apathy, inhibition, irritability, before the disease appears as totally developed. As in the general population, the brain areas most affected by people with Down syndrome and Alzheimer's are the amygdala, hippocampus, and the areas of association of the frontal and temporal parietal lobes. But in Down syndrome, the frontal lobe is less developed, and the cognitive reserve in this area is less. In consequence, the first sign of deterioration would be the reflection of the neural loss typical of Alzheimer's disease. I cannot spend more time on this issue, but I suggest that if you have a special interest, you visit his chapter in that book, Cognitive Deterioration and Alzheimer's in People with Down Syndrome, which is simply magnificent, and which you will find in the book that was published a few months back in Spanish through editorial CEPE by Professor Jesus Flores, titled Syndrome de Down, Neurobiologica, Neuropsychologica et Salud Mental, Down Syndrome, Neurobiology, Neurophysiology and Mental Health. Besides health problems, which we attend to according to the specific preventative medicine programs, we know that the anomalies present in Down syndrome is diverse and different degrees from some individuals to others in terms of intensity and expressivity, affect the 4 dimensions that make up the basis for learning: attention, memory, motivation and language. Neurological research into the brain alterations that are responsible for these deficiencies has demonstrated through the study of murine models that such alterations are due to chromosomal anomalies of the syndrome that prematurely disturb the function of the circuits formed by interneuronal networks. The only way currently of counteracting that disruptive action until additional instruments, which are already starting to be designed, are found, is to favour neuronal functioning and active compensatory circuits of the brain that re-establish part of the lost function. That is what the specific educational intervention does. Therefore, we know that the difficulties in attention, memory, motivation and language are variable according to age and educational experience. Today we could say that there are not ceilings for learning. The reading ceiling was broken, the language and communication ceilings are being broken, along with those of orientation and the estimation and experience of values, and that of the capacity for living with a certain degree of autonomy. Nor are there age limits after which learning is impossible. Today we give maximum value to early intervention because we know we can do more for people with Down syndrome in the first 6 years than during the rest of their lives. But are we clear about the objectives that the school phase has to cover? Or are we so seduced by the lure of strictly academic acquisitions and the obtaining of homolocated qualifications as to overlook the necessary training for real life, preparation for work, autonomous life, correct social skills, communication capacity, etc. We can obtain the answer by asking ourselves what our young people who have completed the school phase are doing now. How many are already occupying a work position adapted to their qualities and aptitudes? How many are following a programme of continuity in training and effective occupation of their time? Or, to the contrary, have they gone back to being shut away in their homes with no greater horizon than the television to a large part of their time? And a large part of the time is devoted by our young people with Down syndrome, according to surveys, and he quotes Izu Kiza 2000 and 2002. With all of this, we should encourage inclusive schools being established as the main tool for socialisation for children and young people with Down syndrome, and as the space where the specific educational intervention necessary to compensate the specific limitations typical of the syndrome can be carried out. For this reason, it is necessary to 1. Promote inclusive school as a medium for giving a response to the educational needs of all pupils, whether they have a disability or not. Define the tutor-teacher as the reference point for all pupils. Establish that pupils with Down syndrome are in the ordinary classroom, not segregated in special classrooms at an education itself, because for that, special education centres exist for those pupils that require very significant adaptations to the curriculum. Strengthen the fact that key pedagogic instruments are individual curricular adaptations, not classroom ones, and specific supports provided by technical auxiliary, pedagogic and audition and language staff based on the specificity of each disability. And 5, encourage in inclusive schoolroom classrooms work being done in a network so that all pupils can share and contribute during the entire education process. The ultimate goal of educational action is to turn out a balanced human being. Undoubtedly, the exercising of certain skill or tasks promotes the development and function of brain structures that serve the execution of this task, providing that overstimulation or boredom is avoided. For this, I repeat that it is fundamental to introduce supports into the classroom through the action of specialised teachers who favour the individualised curricular adaptations necessary in order to ensure balance in the educational practice. However, a caution, beware. Education actions must be ongoing and permanent following conclusion of the education phase in an inclusive school. Logical, adapted in form and method to the age, and since it is considered the main method for the prevention of early appearances of dementias of the Alzheimer type. Finally, I think it is interesting to highlight that in the year 2002, a scientific event of enormous transcendence and importance took place, the sequencing of the human genome. Since then, we have gradually getting to know better and better the connection between the genetic code and its consequences for health, learning and conduct. This is already allowing us to design specific modifications and strategies for the caring of our health, but also for improving their cognitive skills, memory, their learning capabilities for reading, learning and writing, etc. This is what today is called specific treatment of a syndrome. For that reason, specific medical, psychological and pedagogical, etc. interventions for each syndrome are today also a first criterion for quality in education of pupils with the specific educational support needs. I think that we, representatives of the European Down Syndrome Association that are here today, should try to analyse and focus several key questions that affect the very life of our specific and therefore specialised association movement. I'm referring firstly to the reduction in the number of births of people with Down syndrome due to early detection systems and the number of abortions. It is not necessary to secure not easy to secure reliable statistical data, but in a number of large number of cases, it is the doctors themselves who advise mothers to have abortions. I have information that, for example, in Sweden and in Holland, that there are no children being born with Down syndrome anymore. Perhaps some of you can provide us with updated and reliable statistics. Secondly, I am referring to the recently published study, The Correction of Down Syndrome and Edwards Syndrome and Euploidies in the Human Cell Cultures by Tomokazu Emiko, Jeffries Miso and Amona Akihiro, Hong Kong in 2015. It's 2015 DNA Research Volume 22, number 4, which explains the possibilities of applying therapy with natural chromosome ZS-CAN4, which is found in phase 2 of the cells of mammal embryos and occasionally in stem cells, to alleviate the complications present in people with Down syndrome. The results obtained firstly in embryo stem cells of a mouse with an excess of chromosomes, and subsequently in the cells of people with Down syndrome and Edwards syndrome, explain the increase in the number of euploid cells without an excess of chromosomes as the consequence of inoculating the ZS-CAN gene in embryo stem cells. The study is in its early stages, and it has been carried out using cells cultivated in a laboratory and not in live animals or humans. Therefore, the therapeutic application for human beings is currently only potential and technically limited for tackling specific treatments relating, for example, to cognitive functions of Alzheimer's disease. I cannot expand on this subject here, but I suggest that you do address this issue due to the influence that these advances could have on our associations that make up the European Association movement. I would like to finish, because I've been asked to do so. But by suggesting some questions for debate to which we could dedicate some minutes. What measures could we adopt to compensate for the reduction in births of people with Down syndrome? Should the services of the EDS associations expand their care and specialisation towards other syndromes of genetic origin with similar characteristics to Down syndrome? How could we offer our service specialising in Down syndrome to the evaluation teams of the different countries, so that they send to our specialised services people with Down syndrome of a genetic origin with similar characteristics to Down syndrome? What should we do to attract these new potential users from other organisations or services to a more generous nature? And what could we improve in our organisations in order to build loyalty among people with Down syndrome and their families during their different life phases? And finally, would it be possible to open up to other disabilities, such as those considered as part of the autistic spectrum? Today we know that 80% of autism has a genetic basis. With due adaptations and training of staff, is there a lack of specialised centres or resources in the different care areas? And finally, would it be pertinent to attend to people with cognitive disabilities with unknown etiology and characteristics comparable to DS if we have vacant places in our specialised Down syndrome resources? Many thanks for your attention.